In this video, I'm going to be philosophizing on originality being intrinsically unique to heterosexual men, concerned more with, and also heterosexual boys, to the exclusion of homosexual gays and or lesbians and or girls and or women whom are heterosexual, in relation to the prioritization of certain values within communicating one's own original values for individual autonomy, not to mean that others do not value individual autonomy, yet homosexuals, gays, and or lesbians and or heterosexual girls and or women tend to have the most difficulty with, especially within one's integration of thinking in terms of individual autonomy, cultivating original thoughts in relation to why and or what is meaningful about thinking different, not communicating with others to get your ideas and thinking in solitude to originate your own unique moral code in association with the communications of certain underlying psychological needs to originate within your own distinct morality and or ethics one values, and to communicate the fairness associated intrinsic with the individualistic values associated with philosophizing on the self and or individual autonomy, directly and or indirectly necessarily necessary to engage meaningful living and or the cultivation of certain self-knowledge and or self-awareness to improve certain internal and external conditions, not just for the self, more some other selves, meaning that the individuals who've tended to engage philosophizing and or publications concerning individual autonomy, advocating for human rights and or freedoms, directly and or indirectly associated with the meaningfulness of the self, and not necessarily selves to mean one's unique self and or one's unique mind-body connections distinct from others, and why it's meaningful to preserve certain unique intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties within the self to communicate one's own thinking and original thought, and why that's meaningful to others, not to the exclusion of cohorts within the same clique and or who hold meaningful similarities concerning one's intrinsic processes and or intrinsic properties, instead of the unique underlying psychological needs of the self, most meaningful to deliver justice and or fairness within violations of individual autonomy and or privacy. Privacy, most of all, tends to be something homosexual gays and or lesbians and or heterosexual girls and or women tend to have more difficulty thinking why others should be allowed to have privacy, engaging in, say, for example, more private exchanges of goods and or necessities, tending to hold more socialistic values and wanting to do away with privacy. violating individual autonomy and or privacy. Intrinsically, compared to heterosexual men who tend to be most concerned with the harms, most probabilistically to be the causations of certain breaches of intellectual property and or privacy, and or one's individual autonomy associated with breaches of one's mind-body connections and or privacy, and certain violations onto one's individual autonomy often tend to also violate one's privacy concerning one's often choice to go engage in introspections within one's solitude. Often it is homosexual gays and or lesbians and or heterosexual girls and or women who tend to experience more psychophysiological pathologies associated with depression and or anxiety and or loneliness within solitude, compared to heterosexual men and or boys who tend to more value time in solitude to think original thoughts and or to cultivate one's own meaningful concerns and or engage in certain hobbies and or individualized preferred self-tasks, compared to engaging in certain hobbies and or activities as even homosexual boys and or men who tend to prefer, say, even with video games, playing video games with friends, not alone, and or in solitude, and or be it one tends to experience more negative meaningful emotions instead of positive meaningful emotions, compared to one whom enjoys to play video games alone and is more likely to engage more original thinking within the alone time, valuing alone time, associated directly with the value of individual autonomy and or privacy. One is more likely to engage original instantiations from one's original prior existing meaningful experiences, not the lack of meaningful experiences, valuing certain distinctions within underlying psychological needs for often affiliation with others, provided the affiliation allowances certain protections and or mitigations of certain consequences to one's self in relation to perceived threat concerning possible, not necessarily probabilistic, sex and or gender-based violence. Men tend to be less concerned with, and or boys whom are heterosexual, be it boys and or men who are heterosexual, are less likely to experience sex and or gender-based violence, yet are often more likely to experience meaningful concerns related directly and or indirectly to breaches and or violations of one's intellectual privacy, be it that heterosexual boys and or men tend to be the most in terms of individuals who contribute volitionally to the byproducts and or residuals and or derivatives of intellectual property unique to the self, engaging in the most original masterpieces in terms of paintings, in terms of distinct music compositions, and or original works in terms of publications in philosophy and or various sciences, patents in terms of starting distinct businesses, all almost uniquely tend to be originating within heterosexual boys and or men. Not necessarily creative ideas and or intellectual property exhaustively, yet men and or boys in general tend to contribute more to advancing certain concerns within society related to intrinsic property and or original work, as women tend to be more likely to want to cooperate and or have cooperated to engage in certain projects, devaluing original work, and in some cases often doing work one is expected to do alone with others. Counterproductive to the enterprise of the values of intellectual property and or the meaningfulness in terms of instantiating original laws to provide excuse and or justification as to why certain protections and or rights and or freedoms should be granted to individuals for one's unique, meaningful work in birthing intellectual property into existence from one's own unique subjectivity that would not otherwise exist had it not been for the intellectual property one had created from one's own individual autonomy and or privacy granted to be able to originally instantiate the necessary conditions as a must be good enough and necessary conditions. Certain existing priors are meaningful to be cultivated from one's subjectivity, originally instantiating certain well-defined analytic terms to engage the meaningful utterances of thought, to brainstorm and or engage creative conducts responsible for the creations of intellectual property most individual free agents benefit from, including medicines, including various engineered technologies and tools. Had individuals not the individual autonomy and or privacy to be granted the opportunities to think for oneself, would not exist, and we would not have these buildings, nor would we have distinct vehicles you could fly around in the air with. Had it not been for individual autonomy and or privacy and or one's individual rights and or freedoms, increasing the amount of easier access to knowledge and or evaluation of certain knowledge throughout history, as more publications have increased uniquely from heterosexual boys and or men concerning individual autonomy and or privacy rights, as we've become more optimistic and or experience more positive subjective well-being, longer lifespans and or healthy psychological functioning as the byproducts and residuals and derivatives from the individual rights and or freedoms allowance from clear communications and original thinking into what is meaningful about individual autonomy and or privacy, and engaging in original thinking derived from philosophizing, to have originated from the straight philosopher Aristotle, whom, if you read his work, he single-handedly has originally instantiated his own unique thinking on nearly any subject matter and topic you may think of, spanning from the arts to sciences, from visual arts to theater to music to various sciences, physics, medicine, psychology, ethics, morality. Yet, in comparison, homosexual gays and or lesbians, as well to heterosexual girls and or women, tend to be more concerned with less, ironically, publishing within distinct topics and or fields, engaging less polymath thinking and or communications, instead more prioritizing certain moralistic and or ethical concerns, and tending to express certain biases arising within one's unique gender identity, not necessarily sex, more over one's gender identity, concerned with often sexual violence and or gender-related violence, and or publishing within, specifically as it comes to nonfiction, politics and or certain social sciences related to human rights and or freedoms, ironically, yet with often less meaningful consideration for the self in relation to providing meaningful justification and or excuse for individual autonomy, not necessarily the harms and or the costs historically that have been inflicted upon certain minorities to spread awareness of the probabilistic threats, yet to provide the prevention and or the proactive treatment as to the solutions meaningful to contribute to progress, instead of increasing awareness, compared to individuals who have tended to advance policies focusing more on the fair-minded practical considerations for one's individual autonomy and or privacy, almost uniquely communicated by the enlightenment thinkers, whom were straight men and always started as straight boys to be straight men, with certain meaningful concerns for the self in relation to the satisfaction of certain underlying psychological needs for individual autonomy, truly sacred to cultivating more wiser conduct and the appropriate treatment of the other, not necessarily for the self, yet for the self too, but mostly for the other, to provide the appropriate duty of care to caution what constitutes violations into another's individual autonomy and or privacy. That's all I want to say for this video. I hope you have an awesome one. Keep doing those. Absolutely.